Hey guys, welcome to episode 18 of the weekly update. In the series where I talk about the paddles that I hit throughout the week. Now, this is going to be one of the last videos I shoot before I head off on my Asia trip, but anyways, we're going to be doing a very quick first impression rundown of some wide body paddles. Two paddles we'll be highlighting are going to be the Bread and Butter Psycho and the Franklin C45 Tempo series. Now, we'll be talking about these paddles and see how they compare to some other paddles that I was able to hit in my play session, like the Joola Scorpeus, Ronbus Triple B2, and the Bread and Butter Fat Boy. But anyways, let's get into it. All right, first up, let's talk about the Bread and Butter Psycho. This is going to be a Gen 2 14mm wide body, and mine came in with a swing weight of 105 and a twist weight of 6.79. Now, Bread and Butter already has two wide bodies in the Fat Boy and their newly released wide body Filth. However, I do think that these two paddles are a bit too similar to each other and they kind of fall in the same bucket. Because if we're talking about overall firepower where we see their power and pop, I do think that they're very close to each other. The only difference really is in the design and in their surface layers. So the Fat Boy uses Kevlar while the Filth uses carbon fiber. Because of that, the feel of the face is slightly similar, but I do think that they kind of fall in that same control category for a wide body paddle. Now moving on, I'm personally a big fan of the Psycho because I think it's a lot different feeling compared to the Fat Boy and the wide body Filth. And even outside of the Bread and Butter paddles, I do think that this is a unique paddle on the wide body market itself. Now the Psycho actually comes pretty light out of the box. So because it does have that 14mm core and it's light overall, it's much more maneuverable compared to the Fat Boy and Filth. It's got a much lower swing weight, so you can leave it as is to keep it as a really fast 14mm paddle, but this also lets you have room for customization, so you can choose where you want to add weights to customize the paddle to your own liking. Now, personally, I went with just the standard 0.1 ounces of tuning tape on each of the four corners, and that's my go-to when I use these wide body paddles and when I add weight onto them. Now, with this Psycho, you're not going to get as much control as you are with the Fat Boy. With the Fat Boy and the Filth, you're going to get a much more plush feel and a bit more dwell time. So the ball is going to sink in a bit more onto the face, and you're going to be able to control the ball a lot more. Well, you're not going to have that on the Bread and Butter Psycho. Now, the Psycho also isn't going to have the same sweet spot and stability compared to the other 16mm wide bodies. Well, what it does bring to the table along with the faster maneuverability and customization options is the increased firepower it can have. Because of that thinner 14mm core, it doesn't have that same dwell time as the 16mm, and you're going to get more pop off the face. Also, with the weight setup that I had on it right now, it does have more firepower on drives compared to the Fat Boy and the Filth. However, this Psycho is not a power paddle. I would say it's still above average compared to most wide body paddles out there, but again, it's not a power paddle and it's just more offensive compared to a 16mm wide body. Now, one thing I generally don't like about 14mm paddles is how stiff and how harsh the feedback is on shots. Now, what Bread and Butter does to solve this on the Psycho is use a wider 10mm cell diameter inside the core. So we do see this on certain other paddles like the Mark Unmarked, the 11624 Alphas, and most notably the Gherkin Nightshades. So with a CFC layup and a 14mm core and that 10mm cell diameter, this actually has a very similar layup compared to the Gherkin Nightshade series. Now, when I was bouncing the ball around in my house with the Psycho, I could feel the similarities compared to the Nightshade series. However, I do think it's not quite as stiff compared to the Nightshades. I think there's a bit of an edge in terms of the pop on the Nightshades compared to the Psycho. I think the Psycho is just a tad bit more dense. It's really small difference, but you can tell that they do have a different feel off the face. I think the Psycho, from what I believe, also uses a black polypropylene core, and to my knowledge, I think the Nightshades use a standard white polypropylene core, so that may be the difference there. Now, for those of you that know my paddle preferences, you know that I'm a big fan of the Nightshade series, specifically the elongated one, and I think the Bread and Butter Psycho is very close to being a wide body version of the Nightshade series. Now, if you're looking for a more beginner-friendly paddle with more control and forgiveness and stability, then I would actually recommend the Fat Boy and the Filth over the Psycho, which I see as more of an advanced paddle to use. The Psycho is going to offer more maneuverability, more customization options, and also give you a higher firepower ceiling. Now, I personally also enjoy the feel of the face. I like that feel of the 10mm cell diameter combined with that 14mm core because it gives you the extra firepower, but it's also not stiff and harsh on the feedback, and you get a little bit more extra dwell time on that. That's not too much dwell time compared to a 16mm in my opinion. Now, with the Psycho, I enjoy that combination of how it is. I like how it has the stability and forgiveness of a wide body shape. Well, you combine that with something that has a little bit more extra firepower. I don't like mixing the former with something that has more control because then you just turn the paddle into a giant reset machine, which really isn't my play style. Now, this paddle currently isn't released yet, but when it does, it is going to be a recommendation from me. All right, next up, let's talk about the Franklin C45 Tempos. So the 14mm came in with a swing weight of 103 and a twist weight of 6.41, and the 16mm option came in with a swing weight of 105 and a twist weight of 6.52. Now, in a nutshell, the C45 Tempos are basically the hybrid Franklin C45s, just in that wide body slash standard shape. The feel of the face is honestly identical. They both have that really dense Gen 3 like feel where you kind of feel the ball sink in a little bit. I think it's a quite nice feel, but yeah, it's basically the same feel as the hybrid, and it's also very light, just like the hybrid. We just talked about the numbers, but the swing weights and twist weights are pretty low stock for both the 14 and the 16mm, and just like the hybrids, they're both paddles that I personally think require a lot of tuning with lead tape or, tungsten or whatever you like to use around the perimeter of the paddles just to give it that extra stability and to give it extra power because out of the box, these paddles are not very powerful. Now, because I just received these Franklin C45 Tempos, I haven't had the opportunity to really experiment much with weight setups and play these paddles with much more weight added onto them. So as of now, I'm going to classify them both in that control category. But between the 14 and the 16mm, I actually prefer the 14 over the 16. I think the feel out the face is nicer on that one. And it's actually more similar to the hybrid, which only came in the 14mm. But I think the 16mm, I just felt like the ball would sink in a bit too much for my liking. And I think it's a nice option of the 16, but I think it's just overall too soft compared to the 14. The 14 already is soft, and when you add tape onto that, I can anticipate that being a better paddle than a 16mm version of the Tempos with weight added onto it. So overall, nothing too crazy with the Tempo C45s. I think it is nice that there is a 16mm option, but personally, I do like the 14mm better. And if you just wanted that C45 in the wide body shape, this is the exact paddle that you would go for. Personally, I do like this better than the hybrid. Hybrid isn't my favorite shape, so I do like these better, and I do think the 14 is pretty nice. So I'm looking forward to adding some more tape onto that one and experimenting with it more in the future. All right, and the last two paddles we're going to talk about are going to be the Joola Pro 4 Scorpeus 14mm and the Ronbus Ripple version 2 in the R2 shape. So starting off, let's talk about more thoughts on the Scorpeus now that I've had more time with it. I do think it's still one of the hardest hitting 14mm paddles on the market. I think compared to all the other paddles that I hit today, it was the most hollow feeling. It had the least amount of dwell time. I could feel like it had the most pop out of all the paddles that I hit. And the plow through was almost there, but overall, it's like a really nice high firepower paddle. I think it's a fantastic option from Joola. I think their whole Pro 4 series has been pretty solid, and I do think if you like a high firepower standard shape paddle, this is one to go for. All right, now the last paddle we're going to talk about is going to be the Ronbus Riffle R2 V2. Now that I say that out loud, it actually sounds like I'm talking about that droid from Star Wars. But anyways, for the R2 version of the Ripple, I think that this is currently the hardest hitting standard shape paddle on the market right now. I think it's just as powerful as the beta versions is, but there is a difference because now stock, it comes a lot heavier. So I believe I had 116 for the swing weight on this, which is really high for a 14mm standard shape paddle. It has the most power on the drives, and I think it has as much power as the betas, but it does lose out on the pop because now that the paddle is so much heavier, it's got less of that hollow feel that the betas had, and it kind of absorbs the ball a bit more. So it's a bit more dense on contact. So now I think that these versions of the Ripples, specifically the R2 and the R1, these are going to be a bit more controllable compared to the betas. And they're actually going to be pretty controllable, overall, I think, because of just how dense they are. But you're going to lose out on that effortless power that the original series had. So the original betas, they were lighter and they had a lot more pop and the power was easier to come by. But now you're going to need to take bigger swings with this to get that power. So while you do get a lot of power and a lot of potential for power with this RT shape in the new version 2, it doesn't have the pop as something like the Scorpeus Pro 4 14mm, which is, and something like the Paddletech like ESQs. I think those are going to be more poppy compared to this. So I think if we strictly talk firepower, I do think the R2 is top at number 1, but it doesn't have that pop anymore, and it's also just heavier to swing these days. All right, that's it for this week's episode of the Weekly Update. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and let me know what you guys think about it down in the comments below, and I'll catch you all next week.